It's great to be here in Hawaii. I'm Basil from Monash. Been doing my PhD for about a year and a half now, and my interest for the past 7 years has been language policy, how languages are reformed, for example, within certain societies, particularly in East Asia, and also how languages are involved in policy making. So the specific focus of my topic today, it should be up here, but it isn't, is how we write. And let's see if we can get this thing working. Maybe not.
Was that on?
It looked like it was switched on. Oh, it isn't.
No, it wasn't.
Oh, there we go. Well, basically, I'll be talking about a number of scholars that worked in language policy within the government sphere. And these people were involved since the 1930s in language policy formulation. My case study looks at a family of scholars, a particular family called the Kindaichis. They're very famous, renowned scholars, and some are still alive. Their specialty has always been linguistics, and in particular, they look at Japanese language policy. And they've been doing this for a very long time. So here we go. So how we write, I argue, affects the way we communicate our ideas about the world we live in. And there are various socio-political processes that started occurring with the rise of modernity in the 19th century that have impacted the way we write, and hence our ability to communicate in various different ways. So in Japan and in other countries, such as France and Germany, governments soon realized that language policy was an effective tool to chart a course for the various language practices found within society. So the way people speak during this period onwards, the way people listen, write, spell things out, becomes partly dependent on the way the government spells things out, the way the government writes and speaks and talks to the population, okay, that they're responsible for governing. So the earliest calls for language policy, I reiterate, in Japan come from the 19th century, roughly. And they come from bureaucrats and intellectuals that worked for the Tokugawa shogunate. So this is something that goes quite a way back to the late Bakumatsu period. So they're talking the 1860s. And the first government body, though, after Japan began modernizing, that was responsible for conducting linguistic surveys was the Kokugo Chosai Inkai, or loosely translated as the Committee for Language Surveys. Okay, this was a body that emerged in the early 1900s. It was first established in 1901 and began conducting surveys in 1902. And it was headed by individuals with direct involvement or knowledge of the petitions and policy formulation, calls for policy formulation rather, that emerged during the late Bakumatsu period. So there's a connection there as well between government policy after Japan begins modernizing and calls for reform, for language reform, during the late Bakumatsu period in the 1860s. So today, though, we're going to focus, as I said, on the Kindaichis, a particular family of scholars. We're going to look at how they utilize their intellectual capabilities outside of the academic sphere, particularly in government policy formulation. I think this is a topic that's of interest to historians, sociologists, and cultural anthropologists alike. So the Kindaichis, shown up here, start with Kyosuke, who began training in 1910 at Tokyo University as a linguist. He started off specializing in the Ainu language. He was responsible for various works and was involved in language life, or Gengo Seikatsu, which is a particular field that emerged in the 1940s in Japan. And it was the study of how languages are used within day-to-day interactions, okay? And it was something that current researchers contend was a precursor or forerunner to Western sociolinguistics, which emerged in the 60s and 70s. So these three individuals here were considered public intellectuals due to their frequent involvement in various radio broadcasts and television programs later on when we look at Haruhiko and Hideho as well. So Kyosuke began involving himself in Japanese language in particular, because remember he started off as an Ainu specialist in the 1940s when he became a member, a provisional member of the National Language Council, the Kokugo Shinkikai. And as a member of the National Language Council, Kyosuke participated in very public discussions relating to the Joyo Kanji-hyo and the Jion Kanaskai. So how character lists were formulated was a discussion that was held throughout the wartime period in Japan for various reasons that I won't go into now. And these discussions brought him into regular contact with high-ranking officials in the Ministry of Education and the Information Bureau. So what is the Joon Kanji-hyo? It was a set of character lists that was proposed to the Ministry of Education in 1942. It comprised of a fairly long list of kanji, about 2,700 kanji, and the Joyo kanji was just one set list of three different set lists that were proposed during that period. It was part of a grouping of set lists, basically. However, because of the hyper-nationalism, during the period, a lot of people were against reforming Chinese characters. They were against setting restrictions on how many kanji were used in the Japanese language, because they believed that policy involving language perhaps could hinder the way in which people wrote or talked about the imperial household, for example, which had particular kanji used to describe the particular, institutions within the imperial household. It was also a matter of defending the national polity, the kokutai, something that's very important. So language is part of the cultural identity of the kokutai, especially for the Japanese people living within Tokyo, which is where a lot of these discussions were held. However, Kyosuke was fairly persistent, and he was very interested in language policy throughout the wartime period. He wrote a number of works on the Japanese language and how it related to the newly emerging East Asian co-prosperity sphere, for example. So he wrote a book titled Kotodama o Megurite in 1944, towards the end of the Second World War. And this contained numerous chapters, as we can see here, on the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. It also talked about the relevance of the Japanese language within the Japanese Empire. So the book outlines the apparent cultural and intellectual superiority, as he calls it, of the written Japanese language, and encourages its spread throughout the empire as an ideal risotekina writing system that surpasses the majority of its counterparts, English, Chinese, and so on. So through the book, Kyosuke connects with the dominant government discourse here. This is outside of academia. And he connects with the government discourse of cultural reinvigoration and transformation, whilst also demonstrating the way in which linguists increasingly align themselves with government policy during the wartime era. So there are also other examples of scholars that did fairly similar things during this period. Tokieda Motoki is a good example of a professor who was working in Korea, colonial Korea, at Keijo University. He came up with a policy to basically oversee the indoctrination of households within Korea so that they would begin speaking Japanese on a more regular basis within the household. And there was also Hoshina Koichi, another example of a university professor who contributed to language policy from the very early 1900s. He was actually involved in the very first language survey committee I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. And he also continues involving himself as a scholar in policy discussions after the end of the Second World War too. So as we all know, Japan did not win the Second World War. However, the Japanese writing system was still a matter of contention. There were still language problems to be resolved. Kokugo mondai, as a lot of people phrased it. So despite ideological defeat, Kyosuke continued to involve himself in the National Language Council. And he involved himself throughout the first decades of the post-war period, becoming a fully fledged council member and also the head of its honorifics division in 1949. By then, a cabinet order issued by the government at the time turned the progressive Toyo Kanji-hyo, which is this set list down here, which contains much fewer Chinese characters. And they also made sure that rules for kana usage were also included in government policy. This was something that was passed by cabinet order, and it was also found within the Japanese constitution. This was the first official document in Japanese history to contain a mixture of the Joyo Kanji, this new policy, this new character set list, and the kana usage as well. So the Toyo Kanji-hyo and the contemporary kana usage was also quite successful in the way it was taken up by the media, by newspapers, by publishing houses during this period. They're very quick to jump on the bandwagon and say, yes, this is what we need, because it means we use less type. It means that things are more efficient. Automation, office automation, of course, as well, becomes more efficient, quick, cheaper as well. So this is quite a success, and Kyosuke was involved in the policy discussions that brought about these changes in the post-war period in Japan. However, he wasn't fully satisfied with the policies that came out during that period, because he believed that there should be between 2,000 to 3,000 characters in any kanji set list, which is actually coincidentally where today's kanji set list stands, has about 2,150 characters in it. So if he was alive today, he'd be smiling, he'd be a happy man, wouldn't he? So he recognized that from these policies that emerged, the Toyo Kanji-hyo, that a lot of these people involved in these discussions were fairly extreme in their views, in their aims around what they wanted to achieve for the Japanese language, the Japanese people as well. They were radical reformists, as they're normally termed. They wanted to see kanji abolished, and they wanted to make sure that the Toyo Kanji-hyo was the first step in that direction. So he pushed back with a lot of other conservative scholars in order to make sure that the Toyo Kanji-hyo would either remain unchanged or would be revised, which it later was. So in 1958, we have Kyosuke, after having spent 20 years in the National Language Council, retiring basically, both from the academe and from policy discussions, deliberations in the National Language Council. But in his place, 3 years later in 1961, his son Haruhiko joins the National Language Council, the very same body that his father was involved in. Haruhiko is also a university professor like his father. He's perhaps also he's one of the most well-known scholars in the Kindaichi family. His 1957 publication, Nihongo, was one of the best-selling, or perhaps still is actually, one of the best-selling books on the Japanese language to have ever been written. So he made regular appearances on television shows to talk about poetry, to talk about haiku, Japanese language. And he dealt with a variety of topics in these TV appearances. And this thrust him into the spotlight as a lovable and perhaps indefatigable public intellectual, much more so than his father was. Now, he committed himself to language policy by engaging in debates on a variety of different topics, including the limitation of Chinese characters in the Japanese writing system, which was something that was imposed by the government in the early post-war period. And at first he agreed that the major restrictions, or minor restrictions rather, should be placed on the number of kanji used in the Japanese language. This is where he differed from his father's opinions on the Chinese characters used in the Japanese language. He argued that there were still too many kanji in the kanji set list, He thought it was time-consuming, it was a burden on the education system, on children being brought up in Japan, and he thought that a reduction would help with literacy. So, like many intellectuals of his generation, he thought that if kanji were used in abundance, that could potentially complicate the Japanese writing system and compulsory education. So he expressed these sentiments in the 1960s at the National Language Council's general meetings. And he stated that it's more convenient to have fewer kanji in use for the sake of automation as well, not to mention the overlap in different kanji that mean the same thing from an etymological and word formation perspective. So Haruhiko's publications also reflect this stance, and therefore are perhaps indicative of his hopes to see a decrease in the number of kanji found in the Toyo kanji hyo. The period following the 1960s also saw perhaps even higher levels of involvement by scholars in language policy formulation. Under the insistence of Umesawa Tadao, for example, public intellectual as well, pictured here. He was also another member of the National Language Council. Under his insistence, the Japan Foundation was founded in 1972. And in the 1970s, we also witnessed a reconceptualization of language policy within the National Language Council, which had to decide, or which rather had decided by then, to consider creating a new set list of kanji, the the Joyo kanji hyo. And unlike its predecessor, which restricted the number of kanji in use by the government, the Joyo kanji hyo did not place any restrictions on the type of kanji and the number of kanji used in publications, official publications coming out of the ministries of Japan. So Haruhiko continued to write as a kokugo nakusha, and he continued to involve himself in the National Language Council, where deliberations centered mostly on ways of improving, which a lot of people phrased it, it's actually ridding the Japanese language of early post-war language policy. So, the late 70s, I should say as well, brought with it many different changes. Technological advancements that were seen during the period include the invention of the Japanese word processor and its subsequent proliferation into the office and home. And this led many scholars, including Haruhiko, to change their minds about the need for restrictions on kanji usage. Remember, Haruhiko first said, no, we shouldn't have that many kanji on the set list anyways, because it's a burden on children and on other people as well. However, now he changes his mind and says that now that kanji can easily be put into computers, we don't really need to spend too much time in the long run memorizing kanji. So it eliminates the need for complicated and time-consuming technologies and processes. So here I have a quick video to show you about how this development, the development of the word processor in the late 70s played out in the public and private sphere.
New business now. Kindaichi sensei, 事件です。いや、本当に大事件なんですよ。漢字が入った文字は簡単にできるんです。こんなに綺麗に。小さくなって素早く。意外に乗りにくいという日本の定評は見事に覆されました。これは日本のビジネスにとって大変明るい事件です。シャープ日本語ワードプロセッサー。
Great advert. Very expensive, exactly. I wouldn't have bought one if I was working. But it shows you how office automation played such a big role during this period in policy, language policy discussions. Now that you could use a computer basically, or word processor to type out text easily without having to memorize kanji, or stroke order, or compounds, kanji compounds, Haruhiko decided that no, we no longer need to place restrictions on language policies, on kanji set lists. It's actually easier now to use kanji, to use language, to use the Japanese language that he would say, grew up with. So he was awestruck, I think, by this development. And he was also awestruck by the way in which the word processor was taken up. It was a major event, as the advert puts it, and it quickly changed his mind about the placing of restrictions on kanji. Policymakers, however, with the help of Haruhiko and other scholars in the National Language Council, had already revised the early post-war character set list of 1946, a year before this word processor was released. So the year was 1981. And though Haruhiko retired from the National Language Council in 1988, after 2.5 decades as a member, he would continue to comment on language policy and language usage in his publications in the media, newspapers, and elsewhere. Now, Haruhiko's son, Hideo, much like his father, is a public intellectual, makes regular appearances on television shows and radio broadcasts to discuss the Japanese language, and also his family legacy. By now, the Kindaichis are quite a big name in Japan within certain circles. So Hideo is also a professor. He's a professor at Oberlin University in Japan and visiting scholar at the National Graduate Institute. I found this interesting, for policy studies, which describes itself, the institute describes itself as comprising world-class academics with expertise in public sector policy formulation. In 2010, Hideo advised the Tokyo Metropolitan Government on a policy initiative aimed to reignite interest in written Japanese among the youth of Japan. Kotoba no Chikara Saisei Project, or the project to regenerate the power of words, set its sights on reconnecting a technologically over-dependent youth with the printed word. Policymakers found that the digital age that was hailed by the likes of Hideo's father, Haruhiko, the major event of the Japanese word processor and its limitless opportunities, had severed the ties between many youth and many language users and their writing system. This was a problem that needed to be rectified by encouraging the youth to engage with print media once again. However, due to the project's timing, which began towards the end of 2010 and early 2011, the initiative immediately lost traction with the tsunami and nuclear meltdown of 3/11. So it remains to be seen what other language policy initiative Hideo involves himself in. He hasn't really involved himself in much since the initiative in 2010. So I'll briefly outline the ways in which the Kindaichis were involved in language policy formulation. However, what common ground is shared between these scholars? That's one of the important questions I think we need to come to terms with. Firstly, I think that Kyosuke, Haruhiko, and Hideo all studied or taught at elite universities. There's this sort of feature running through people involved in language policy. These three individuals happen to have either taught or studied at Tokyo University. Hideo went to Yale as a researcher, also taught at Columbia. They spent a significant portion of their careers in Tokyo, the capital city, and are well published by some of the leading publishing houses, such as Imanami, Kodansha, Chikuma, and Kadokawa. So this demonstrates that in many respects the Kindaichis are intellectual elites in the field of Japanese language studies and linguistics, and that perhaps the majority of people, individuals involved in policy discussions at an official level are people with a similar sort of background. Now, what parallels can be drawn between scholarly opinion and engagement in policy formulation bodies that currently oversee the linguistic conventions of other languages, such as French? So how do scholars in other countries engage with policy formulation in other places? And what input do these scholars have in shaping the course of government-sponsored language policy? These are a few questions that I'd like to put to you here, because I really don't have any answers to those particular questions. But I think they'd be very interesting questions to answer, especially for those who are interested in language, history, linguistics, or even social studies, sociology. So whether we're talking about the information age, or post-truth or postmodern information societies, however you want to phrase it, changes occurring to writing systems since the 19th century and onwards have had significant precursors. The the changes that we see occurring around us today have been occurring for a very long time, for very specific reasons in certain cases. So we have to try to think about looking at the active engagement of scholars with government policy and how such engagement determines how we write and communicate today. How we study these changes and trends may give us a better insight into how policies and languages may be managed in the future. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for that talk. That was wonderful. And now we're going to hear from Hannah Kunert. Her talk